The concept of twin films will always be an interesting study. In 1997, we would have Volcano and Dante's Peak released just 2 months apart. In 98, we would get Deep Impact and Armageddon, again just 2 months apart. 1981 though, we would get something truly special. With all due respect to Wolfen, the Albert Finney and Gregory Hines starring werewolf movie about a cop trying to solve a series of animal attacks.
Is it a werewolf movie? What is it? And where he's talking about shifting and being on the scene where he strips down and he's on the beach running around and he's sort of foaming at the mouth and lapping at the water and baying at the moon and Albert Finney's character's there. It is a terrifying sequence. It's a sequence that certainly, for other projects have studied that scene.
There were 2 very big wolf-centered movies that year. An American Werewolf in London and The Howling, which would see 2 legendary directors take a swipe at werewolf movies that ended up very different, but will always be tied to one another as their production shared and melded parts of their production. Today on 80s Horror Memories, we dive into the year of the werewolf and see why these 2 movies are so special and remain staples of our horror viewing. As iconic as the Wolfman is throughout the annals of horror history, there were only a handful of really big ones. Werewolf of London and the Wolfman are the 2 biggest ones that people remember, but Universal tried to keep that train going by having him appear in some of their other group monster movies. He would also get an appearance alongside Abbott and Costello. But by the time 1981 rolled around and gave us 3 stellar lycanthrope-related movies, there had been a dry spell. The truth is, some foreign fare aside, there hadn't been a proper wide-release werewolf film since Hammer's Curse of the Werewolf, starring Oliver Reed in 1961. Showing how hard it was to nail a werewolf movie, Hammer would only have the one while putting out 6 movies about Dr. Frankenstein and 9 total films about Dracula.
American Werewolf in London was a great combination for me of fantastical possibilities with humor.
The idea for an American Werewolf in London came to writer-director John Landis over a decade earlier when he was a production assistant on the Clint Eastwood World War II movie, Kelly's Heroes. He wrote the script in 1969, but didn't have the clout to get it made just yet. His first feature would be the eventual cult classic, Schlock, and that would lead to studios taking a chance on the director, who would reward that trust with a string of hits, including Animal House, Kentucky Fried Movie, and The Blues Brothers. He would eventually be given a budget of $10 million to make his movie that had been rolling around in his head for over 10 years. While the studio pushed for recognizable big-name stars, Landis went with his gut and cast relative unknowns David Naughton, Griffin Dunne, and Jenny Agutter.
I saw American Werewolf in London, downtown Pittsburgh, movie theater called The Bank Cinemas, with Tom Savini actually, because Tom and I were friends at that point. I think my fascination with it started with the Fangoria cover, which was like a drawing of one of the transformation heads that Rick Baker had done.
While Landis was working on his love letter to the old Universal monster movies, the first book in an eventual series took bookshelves by storm and would be, of course, optioned for film rights. Joe Dante wouldn't be known for his scripts, And this would be no different, as he would bring in future Academy Award nominated screenwriter John Sayles. Sayles had written the script for Dante's first solo directorial effort with 1978's Piranha. Instead of going with more unknown actors like Landis did, Dante would insert famous character actors like Dick Miller, Slim Pickens, John Carradine, and Kevin McCarthy. They would join Patrick Macnee, Dee Wallace, Dennis Dugan, and Christopher Stone, amongst others. Dante had already used Kevin McCarthy and Dick Miller in Piranha, and one of his trademarks would be to use the same actors over and over, even if they were in minor roles.
Joe Dante is another director who really understands the tension that comes between... this is the thing. People go to see horror movies, they laugh a lot. But they're not laughing, well, sometimes they're laughing at the movie, but that's what you try to avoid. They're laughing because you've got them.
The Howling follows just the bare bones of the novel it is very loosely adapted from. About the only thing that Winkless and Sayles took from the book was the main character, Karen, though spelled differently in both mediums, going to a retreat with her husband after a violent incident. Even with the title being The Howling, the movie does a great job subverting expectations for first-time viewers by having the newscaster Karen attacked by a serial killer. It's only later that you find out that Eddie Kist is a werewolf. The retreat that Karen and her husband go on is actually full of werewolves. The therapist that Karen is seeing decides to send her to what he calls the colony. But it turns out that Eddie is part of their pack. Pun very much intended. Karen's husband is seduced and turned into a werewolf, and Terry, who Karen asked to join her there to investigate after Karen believes Eddie to be there, is killed by a now werewolf Eddie. It's a great scene, and even though you are already aware of the werewolves by then, it gives us the great transformation scene and kills a character that would have ended up being a final girl of sorts.
You're like, oh shit, this is really gonna take this lady out.
Really, all of the movie and how it looks just screams Joe Dante. He may not write his own movies, but he imbues his own characteristics into every one of them. Having the same actors show up in small roles is also the equivalent of cinematic comfort food. After Terry's killed by werewolf Eddie, her boyfriend Chris comes to investigate and not only kills Eddie but exposes the entire colony for what they are. People who turn into werewolves at will rather than only by the light of a full moon. This is not only different from most werewolf lore, but also its twin release that year. In another part of the world, American backpackers David and Jack are in Yorkshire when they come across the Slaughtered Lamb, a pub with some locals who are not friendly at first, but eventually warn them to stick to the roads. They wander off the roads into the moors and are attacked by a wolf, with Jack dying and David being bitten. While the locals kill the creature, David sees a man lying naked. He wakes up weeks later in a London hospital and is told he and his friend were attacked by a lunatic. Jack appears to David in spirit and warns him that he must kill himself before the next full moon, or he will kill innocent people. David has awful, vivid dreams, but doesn't fully believe he will turn into anything, while also starting a relationship with his nurse Alex. A more deteriorated Jack tells David once again to end his life, but he refuses, and the next night he does indeed change into a werewolf. This scene is on the Mount Rushmore of practical effects, and it's a testament to how good the movie is that it's not the only scene that people remember.
I had already done The Howling with Rob Bottin, and there's a whole story about how Rick and Rob fought over who came up with the technique. I don't want to get into that right now. Rick did.
David kills innocent people but has no memory of it until he sees it on the news and realizes that it must have been him. Jack appears one final time, now accompanied by the corpses of the 6 people that David killed the previous night, and pleads with David one final time to end the curse. David changes again and kills a few more people before being shot by the police after Alex pleads with the wolf. While it appears he understands her, his base urges take over and he lunges at her before being shot.
And it's a tragic ending too. There's no happy ending to that movie. There's no happy ending to that movie, which I think also really does epitomize the late 70s and 80s horror movies.
While they do use the full moon, silver bullets are not needed to end the life of a werewolf here. The 2 movies were both successful, though London would do better bringing in $62 million on its $6 million budget, and The Howling returning $18 million on its $1.5 million budget. Both movies were like nothing we'd ever seen before, and they each take different approaches to their eventual final products. An American Werewolf in London is more darkly humorous, where The Howling takes an almost tongue-in-cheek approach. The Howling has some surprise character deaths, while London kills off one of its main characters early on, even though death isn't about to keep him out of the movie. London has a smaller, more intimate cast, while The Howling has an almost crowded feel. Then there's the special effects, and boy oh boy are they special.
You always wanted to see a werewolf transformation? Here's your werewolf transformation.
When I saw these movies as a kid, I was absolutely floored with what they were able to accomplish in terms of their creatures. Watching David turn into a wolf for the first time is like watching a magician do tricks in front of your eyes. You know it's not real, but you'd be hard-pressed to explain exactly what's going on.
I remember sitting in the theater and we were all gobsmacked at watching what was happening on film with the extension of his face and the hairs growing out.
The hair thing, I did that one. That was good. I'll tell you how that was done. It's pretty obvious now, though. But made a fake arm, smooth on once again. Put this fine wire mesh behind it, and then punched in all the individual hairs. Punched them all in, and then flipped the arm over, opened it up, put acrylic plastic on the back that would grab all of where those hairs were punched in. So it just looks like a normal arm from the front with hair like that. But in the back, all those hairs, the other end of them were connected to acrylic plastic. Put handles on that, rolled film, pulled the hair through the fake arm, and then when the film was reversed, it looked like it was growing out.
The Howling gets the job done almost as well, with its creatures being more of a callback to Lon Chaney's more human-wolf hybrid. Except, well, it looks a lot better here. Both of these movies are shining examples of why practical effects will always beat CGI.
And there's no fun in that. There's no artistic endeavor in entering things on a computer and it just appears. It's too easy. It doesn't require blood, sweat, and tears, which is what made that transformation so great.
This category is also where the 2 films share something. Rick Baker was already fairly established, working with directors like Larry Cohen and a little-known director named George Lucas with his little space opera. But he was also familiar with Landis. In fact, he was a makeup artist on Schlock back in 1973 for Landis, and he was told about the Werewolf movie that John was trying to get going. He agreed to help out with that movie, but it took so long to get off the ground that he eventually assumed it wasn't happening. He joined Dante's project, but would eventually leave to fulfill his promise to Landis. It worked out okay for him.
We're all sitting there with our mouths hanging open. We're all kids, right? It's Rick Baker. And I raised my hand like a student. I said, well, Rick, it sounds great. It sounds way better than The Howling, but who's going to make all this stuff? And Rick's like, you kids are going to do all this. And I'm like, we don't know how to do that stuff. Come on. So he goes, that's okay, I'm going to teach you. And so we did. We just learned it step by step. And the thing that was really fascinating about that is because because Rick had confidence in this young ragtag group of kids. It gave us all confidence. If Rick Baker was going to stamp his name on the work that we helped him create, that told us that we were maybe better than we thought we ever could imagine. So it really gave us a lot of confidence, and it made the project go much more smoothly.
Losing Rick Baker is always going to be a devastating proposition. But how do you fill that void? How about by plugging in wonderkin Rob Bottin? Bottin had worked with Baker on Star Wars, and had also worked with Dante prior to this on Piranha, so the transition was an easy one. While Baker would win the Oscar, Bottin would set himself up to make some of the greatest effects of all time just a year later on John Carpenter's The Thing. His work with the air bladders and real-time transformation in the scene where we see Eddie transform is one of the quintessential moments, not only of the movie, but of the 1980s as a whole. The discussion on which film is better is one of the more difficult and subjective conversations of the 1980s. It would come down to which one you saw first, your preference of Joe Dante versus John Landis, or your feelings on the rules of werewolves.
The Howling, for me, that transformation is the better werewolf transformation. I really think it is. Because there's one shot in The Howling where you go back wide and you realize just how tall the werewolf is in contrast to the woman. And that instantly made it feel so palpably real. It wasn't bits and pieces, it was a wide shot. And they did all the little interstitials and then boom.
For me, An American Werewolf in London was what I saw first, and it resonated with me more with the emotional stakes of the characters. And I'd be lying if I said I didn't fall in love just a little bit with Alex. I looked for more David Naughton and Griffin Dunne movies, and for me, it's the greatest werewolf movie of all time. The Howling was something I discovered later in life. I already knew who Joe Dante was and enjoyed his work and was going through his catalog. I've grown to love the collection of character actors as well as appreciating it for what it is, rather than just being disappointed that it isn't London. The legacy of both films is very different. An American Werewolf in London is widely appreciated, but did get a dud of a sequel of sorts with An American Werewolf in Paris. As good as the special effects are in London, they are that bad with CGI in Paris. The Howling became a ludicrously long series, even eclipsing the book series of 3, with a total of 8 films. Some of those have moments to enjoy, but none of them came close to the magic and spectacle of the first. While the movies will live on for generations to enjoy, we'll never have another year like 1981, a year where full moons, silver bullets, and wolf attacks were all the rage.
We hope you enjoyed our dive into the year 1981. Next up, we journey to the mysterious mountain of power in the year 1982. Join us as we take a look back at the birth of a fearless fighter hell-bent on revenge and displaying a level of masculinity synonymous with the era, with Conan the Barbarian. Until next time, gorehounds.
Okay, American Werewolf in London. I had already done The Howling, with Rob Bottin, and there's a whole story about how Rick and Rob fought over who came up with the technique. I don't want to get into that right now. Rick did. So I knew, I had all the basics on how to make it. We used foam rubber for the transformation heads in the Howling. So we couldn't get quite as much stretch. Rick came up with this stuff. It was a smooth-on material. Now smooth-on makes every kind of resin, every kind of urethane possible. But back then, I don't know how Rick found this, but it was a very flexible, elastic material. He goes, fuck foam rubber, we're going to make this out of this new material I found. And so we could get more stretch out of it, and it seemed to be a little bit more realistic. So, it's just, in the beginning, it was the first film I did with Rick, and I had always wanted to work with Rick. He was my hero growing up as a child. And so, we go in, and he's got all these kids. I think I was, Jesus, how old was I then? I was probably 21, maybe 20. And, he brings us all together. There's 7 of us, and all kids that Rick had handpicked from around the country because, just like me, they had been corresponding with him and sending him pictures of their shitty work. And, back then we didn't have the couple thousand people we have in the industry now. So Rick had to kind of handpick and then teach us. So what happened was, in the beginning of working with Rick in this new team on American Werewolf, is he put us through boot camp. And he goes, okay, we're going to practice life casting today. Long before we did life castings on Griffin Dunn, David Naughton. And this is the way I like to do it, and so we're going to practice this, and then when the actors come in, we'll do it this way. And then he explained the transformation. He goes, here's what we're going to do. We're going to make this whole, we're not only going to see the ears growing and the teeth growing, like we saw in the Howling, the claws growing, the snouts growing, we're going to show hair grow, and we're going to do a whole body. We're going to do a miniature puppet, a half-scale puppet of David, completely nude, partially transformed. We're going to literally contort that into a wolf shape in one shot. And we're all sitting there with our mouths hanging open. We're all kids, right? And it's Rick Baker. And I raised my hand like a student. I said, well, Rick, it sounds great. It sounds way better than the Howling, but who's going to make all this stuff? And Rick's like, you kids are going to do all this. And I'm like, we don't know how to do that stuff. Come on. So he goes, that's okay, I'm going to teach you. And so we did. We just learned it step by step. And the thing that was really fascinating about that is because Rick had confidence in this young ragtag group of kids, it gave us all confidence. If Rick Baker was going to stamp his name on the work that we helped him create, that told us that we were maybe better than we thought we ever could imagine. And so it really gave us a lot of confidence, and it made the project go much. The hair thing, I did that one. That was good. I'll tell you how that was done. It's pretty obvious now, though. But made a fake arm, smooth on, once again. Put this fine wire mesh behind it, and then punched in all the individual hairs, punched them all in, and then flipped the arm over, opened it up, put acrylic plastic on the back that would grab all of where those hairs were punched in. So it just looks like a normal arm from the front with hair like that. But in the back, all those hairs, the other end of them were connected to acrylic plastic. Put handles on that, rolled film, pulled the hair through the fake arm, and then when the film was reversed, it looked like it was growing out. So that blew people away. It was a very simple trick. Now, unfortunately, we weren't able to make the full body puppet work. We tried, we sculpted it, we molded it, we cast it, but ultimately we flipped it, we switched it because we couldn't, just time-wise, monetarily, we couldn't get it was a very tough job trying to get a half-scale David Naughton to turn into a fucking wolf. So we just did it in cuts and ended up using a fabricated kind of half wolf. If you see, after David falls on the floor and he's got these long extended legs that are kicking around terribly, it's so poorly puppeteered. They're like, and those hands, I don't know what Rick was thinking. Even John was mad. Landis, the director, David comes on set with these big, hands. You saw him in the movie. And John's like, I can't film this, Rick. What are you doing to me? They look like Popeye. Which, strangely enough, I went on set on Innocent Blood with John, which I did the effects for that vampire film. Don Rickles plays a vampire, and as he starts The nurse he's in the hospital, the nurse opens the window, the sun floods in, and the first thing he does is he puts his hands up, and we had bladders under Scotch-Light, once again, the glowing stuff, pre-split appliances, so when we puffed them a little bit of air, you'd see all the cracks, and we hit it with a beam splitter and the Scotch-Light, and it was glowing embers underneath. It was so fucking funny. I started cracking up, and John didn't appreciate it, Landis, but so Don Rickles comes out there, the nurse opens, puts his hands up, screaming, the arms, inflate so it'll show all the riverbed cracks. And John goes, cut! Steve, what are you doing to me? These look like Popeye. I can't film it. I'm like, John, you just said that, 5-6 years ago to Rick Baker.
Hi friends, your humble narrator Tyler Nichols here, and I hope that you enjoyed that episode of 80s Horror Memories. If you missed our previous episode, click over here. If you want to see more from our series, click up here. And if you're not subscribed yet, what are you doing? Subscribe right here. And most importantly, stay spooky, folks.